Can you describe for our listeners this idea of instructional gap analysis? And you actually mentioned in your book, it's as a, quote, systematic framework for breaking down a learning challenge and selecting appropriate and effective learning strategies. In fact, Julie, in your book, I believe in chapter 1, entitled Where Do We Start?, you share that, quote, if learning is a journey, that's the gap between where they are and where they need to be. Sometimes the gap is knowledge, but just as often the gap can be skills, motivation, habit, and environment. Can you share with our listeners a little more on that idea?
Yeah. So, the question is, if somebody is there right now and they're not doing the thing. So maybe the thing is, making use of some functionality that exists in an ERP system or something like that. So there's some functionality that they can use to communicate or document or whatever, whatever the thing is, and it's not being used right now. So asking ourselves, is the gap between where that learner is right now and where they need to be or where we would like them to be, if the objective is, the learners will be able to use this functionality to effectively document XYZ. Is it just knowledge? Is it just they need to know that that function exists and how it works, in which case we can explain that to them. And knowledge is the easy problem in a lot of ways because we have so many tools for disseminating it. We can send you a PDF, we can create a short video, we can do a webinar and show you how it works, and all this kind of stuff. Getting knowledge out in the world is, in many ways, I mean, I don't want to downplay it because there's an art to doing it well and a science to doing it well. But in some ways, it's the easiest problem to solve. How do I just communicate or share out this piece of knowledge or information? Sometimes, I also talk about procedural gaps, which is any gap between where they are and where they need to be, where we have a really well-defined expectation of what this looks like. So, for example, if the gap is they need to be able to create this report and populate it in the system, that's pretty procedural in terms of steps. You click on create, and then you do this, and then you click this, and then you format it this way, and you set stuff up. And so that's pretty spelled out. Like, we know exactly what the steps are that we want somebody to do, and there's a little bit of judgment or variation, but by and large, we have pretty well-defined performance. And so those are knowledge and procedure, and that's typically where learning and development spends most of its time right now. But then there's the question of some other types of gaps. And so my gap framework is based on kind of the classic, which is knowledge, skills, attitude, or there's different ways to phrase it, but it's an expansion on that. And I have some pretty specific criteria that I talk about when I think about skills. So if we have really well-defined performance, we know exactly what we need people to do. I kind of refer to that as a procedure, but skills is any other situation where we really don't think people are going to be good at it unless they've practiced it. So for example, filling out a timesheet, somebody can probably get the instructions and be good at that out of the gate. They probably don't need to practice filling out their timesheet in order to be proficient at it. But if it's playing golf, nobody expects that I can just sort of explain to you how to play golf and that you could go and do it well.
Right.
Of course, it's something that needs to be practiced. But then it's interesting because I think we understand the importance of practice for skills that are visual, like sports or music, where it has I suppose it's auditory, but there's a clear output that we can see. Language learning is pretty clear, anything like that. And also, we know that we don't want doctors and helicopter pilots and people driving on the road who haven't practiced before they kind of get turned loose on the world.
Right.
And so I sort of refer to this as the sports and things where you can kill people conundrum, which is we understand the importance of practice in all of those domains. But then as soon as we move a skill into the cognitive domain, we kind of forget. We think we can just tell people. So we can send people to a 2-day class on supervisor training, and we can, give people an e-learning that shows them procedurally how to fill out the performance review stuff. But if I ask people, is creating a performance review a skill or not a skill? I have a little game I'll play with when I'm teaching this, and I'll play skill, not a skill. And pretty much everybody will say, oh, it's a skill. People need practice to be good at it. Well, how often does, the training on how to do performance reviews include actually practicing crafting a feedback statement and then getting somebody to give you feedback on whether it's an effective or ineffective way to do feedback statements and kind of creating that actual practice cycle around it? I have seen a lot of training on performance reviews, and I really haven't seen that much at all. And, another question that I ask to identify if we're dealing with a skill is what's the difference between your acceptable performer and your best performer? So somebody who's meeting job requirements, they're probably a solid middle grade on their performance review. They're doing it. They could do it better, but they're doing it, versus somebody who's really good at it. Like, how big is that stretch between just okay and really good? And that tells you that there's a lot of skill in that if there is a big stretch between those two, and that the kinds of things that we need to do to support that kind of learning is actually pretty different. I can't just tell you what to do. You have to see examples. You have to see probably many examples. I'm really interested in the question of how many case examples do you need to see before you can start to recognize these more tacit patterns. You probably need to do some differentiation between good and bad. You probably need to practice doing it yourself and get feedback from somebody who's quite good at it, who can kind of critique you on things. You probably need to have some ongoing coaching around this. And so it's a very different, I can't just tell you the steps and send you out into the world. I have to create practice environments where you're getting effective feedback.
Yeah.
What Anders Ericsson kind of refers to as deliberate practice. He's the researcher that's behind the slightly infamous 10,000 hour rule from Malcolm Gladwell,
right.
is the deliberate practice guy.
Yeah.
And so that kind of thing when you're dealing with skills. Then habits are an interesting one to me, because even if you have the knowledge, even if you have the skill, even if you have the motivation, sometimes it doesn't become a habit. I can know how to floss my teeth. I can even be pretty good at flossing my teeth. And I can really want to floss my teeth. I'm like, I don't want the dentist to yell at me the next time I go to the dentist. And yet it still doesn't always formulate into a daily habit. And so what's the difference between, if you have knowledge, you have skill, you have motivation, and yet it's still not happening because it's just not that regular habit? What are strategies to support that? And there's a lot of nice research coming out in the habit space right now. It's being focused on quite a lot. And so there's really good stuff around how do we support habits and things like that. And then motivation is anything where it's like they know what to do, but they're still not doing it. The classic question is, if they could do it if you gave them $1 million, then it's not really a training problem at that point. It's a motivation issue.
Yeah.
And that goes into the behavior change stuff. I've got a whole laundry list of things that sit underneath that that we look at. One of the big ones being the whole, is there an environment of feedback reinforcing that behavior? Or are they actively, we say they're being reinforced, but really they're kind of being discouraged because we're telling them they need to go faster or do more, or, whatever the thing is. But what's behind that? And then environment is what I was referring to kind of at the beginning around the user experience piece, which is, we've spent a lot of time and money trying to manage recycling as an individual behavior. Can you sort your recycling? Can you figure out what you're supposed to recycle? And honestly, there's real question, in the overall environmental community about this is that last mile approach of we're trying to fix it in terms of individual human behaviors. And really, this is probably an organizational problem, right? How do we create environments where people just aren't using as much plastic, and manufacturers are incented to figure out things that don't create a ton of plastic in the way that they build their products or package their products, or things like that. And there's only so much we can do at this very last little tail end by kind of adapting the human behavior. We really need to look at the bigger system and ask the question of what are the incentives around this much plastic being in the world, and is the appropriately recycling your plastic bottles the right inflection point to invest in to try to address the problem? Or do we really need to go upstream and try to figure out some other ways to deal with it there? So that's a case of environment where, honestly, fixing the system is probably going to be better than fixing the user. And there's some stuff where we are reliant on fixing the user. We just had the world's biggest behavior change experiment in COVID. And, I realized that we've very much focused on all the places that behavior change experiment failed. But actually, it was remarkable how much behavior was changed. And it was truly remarkable how many people did adopt the behaviors, because ultimately that is a case where wearing a mask or not wearing a mask does come down to an individual behavior level. Being able to kind of take a goal, we want people to use this functionality in the ERP system to document, and then really kind of asking, breaking it down in terms of that framework of what's the gap between where they are and where they need to be. And if it's not knowledge, then telling them louder and more emphatically that they need to do something is probably not going to be the solution.
So it can be skills, motivation, habit, or environment, or organizational settings.
Yep.